hear about this issue.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm honored to have a conjoined committee meeting. I don't know if I've ever done that before. So the Fisheries Committee and the Wildlife Committee would like to recognize Bobby Wilson.
And Bobby, if you wouldn't mind, I forgot to remind everybody, even though we all know who you all are and the important titles that you have within the agency, we've got a lot of members of the public and sportsmen and women around the state who are watching and would love to just make sure for the record folks know who's talking. And so if you wouldn't mind, you and your team, y'all make sure that we know who you are.
Thank you, Chairman. I don't know if I heard all what you said, but for those benefit of the television folks or the people who are watching the video, I'm Bobby Wilson, Assistant Director of TWRA and Field Operations. So this will probably be one of the shortest presentations that you'll ever, or you have ever seen me give in front of the commission, and you might appreciate that. But I'm here today to introduce Rule 1660-1-32. It's a proposed new rule dealing with species that are in need of management, threatened, and endangered for Tennessee. And this is not a rulemaking hearing. It's merely a provide discussion about the intent and purpose of the proposed rule for your information. So I'm going to go pretty quick here. Hang on a second. I think I am. Maybe not. Right click or left click? All right. See, I thought.
That's not it, is it?
No, that's part of it. Let's see. Okay. Was it right? Okay. Thank you, Jason. So a little bit about the background into the history of the state threatened and endangered species list. The National Endangered Species Act was enacted back in 1973, so the state of Tennessee followed suit by basically enacting the same thing for Tennessee in 1974. And when they did that, one of the stipulations was that the species that are listed or to be listed for as threatened and endangered and in need of management would be placed. They were placed in proclamation. So this list was last amended in 2000. And in 2015, the TWRA staff encouraged the update. So in January of 2016, former Chief of Biodiversity, Bill Reeves, brought before the commission the same kind of proposal, and a lot of discussion ensued. And so I think there was also a presentation given several months ago by Chief Reeves and brought up a lot of questions and concerns. And so just bringing this forward today to try to clarify some of that and talk about it. I'm here just to introduce it. I'm not going to go into the details of all of it. We'll have somebody else talk about that, and I'll mention that in a second. So what is the purpose of the rule? Well, it's required by the Code of Tennessee in 70-8-101 is the Tennessee Non-Game and Endangered or Threatened Wildlife Species Conservation Act, 1974. And as I mentioned, part of the, is one of the subsequent acts as part of this is that the commission will promulgate regulations, number one, that list the endangered and threatened species in Tennessee and makes those available to the public. It's spelled out in the law. And that they will update those lists every 2 years to reflect any changes that have occurred. So basically that's all this rule does. It's nothing about regulations. It's strictly to, for the commission to put this in, to create this rule, to put these lists into the rule, as well as update that list that hasn't been updated in quite a while. And that every 2 years it will be updated if there are additional species to be added. So that's about all I wanted to introduce the bill. I want to introduce the speaker who is going to give you an overview of the endangered species and the rule itself. And that is Pandy English, who is the Assistant Chief of Biodiversity. And Pandy, if you'll bring her up.
Right click, okay. Right here. There. All right. Well, thank you, Commission, for allowing me to come in and give you a review of this rule. And I am the Assistant Chief of Biodiversity. There's no chief, so, you know, I'm the, you're going to have to take me. But I am in the Biodiversity Division. The goal of the Biodiversity Division is to downlist or delist species from the Endangered Species Act. That is our role, that is our goal. And our goal is to prevent any further listing of any Tennessee species onto the Federal Endangered Species Act. And what this list does for us, I mean, it includes endangered species, threatened species, and in need of management species. And what it does is it gives us guidelines. It tells us which species we need to focus our attention on, which species we need to invest time and energy on so that we can prevent species from being added to the federal listing. And when I say we, you know, it's TWRA, but we've got a lot of our partners in the room with us today, and they include TDEC, and we got Defenders of Wildlife here, the Tennessee Wildlife Federation, so we have many partners that join with us on this. So, I mean, what are these species? So if you label a species endangered, that means that that species is in jeopardy. That species is at risk. If it's state endangered, that species is at risk of being exterminated from this state, being extirpated from this state. If it's federal listed, it means that it's in jeopardy of being lost to the nation, to the entire nation. So endangered means that it's incredibly rare. And we have an endangered species right out our back door here in 7 Mile Creek and in Mill Creek, and that is the Nashville crayfish. And so one of the concerns about lists like this is that they may halt development. But we have the Nashville crayfish right here in downtown Nashville, out at the airport, here in this area in Nolensville. And it's never halted development. We work around it. And I have been a part of Nashville crayfish sweeps many times. So if anyone needs to work in one of these creeks, what we do is we scoop them all up and we put them in buckets and we put them 500 yards upstream. Folks go in, they do their work, we let the crayfish go, and then they go back home and everything's fine. So everybody does what they need to do. So the Nashville crayfish has never stopped any development here in Nashville, and we don't want it to. So we've got the endangered species, and then we have threatened species. So threatened species are those species that if we don't do something about their declining populations, then they are in jeopardy of becoming endangered. So it's a progressive list. So in Tennessee, we have the alligator snapping turtle. And the alligator snapping turtle is threatened in Tennessee. And it is a species that we have been actively working on for years. And it is our goal, and we are involved in a multi-state project to where we can propagate, release, and increase the numbers of alligator snapping turtles in the waterways of Tennessee, especially in West Tennessee. You'll notice that Rob Colvin took this picture. He's one of our wildlife biologists and is considered one of the experts on alligator snapping turtles. So in that state, multi-state project that we're embarking on, other states are turning to us. We have a lot of data on alligator snapping turtles. We have protocols in place, and they're turning to us to learn what they should do in order to be able to increase their alligator snapping turtle populations. So one of the tools that we use is propagation, restoration, and increasing numbers of populations. And then we have in need of management. So in need of management is something that has its own rule or proclamation now that the director of the agency has determined that this is a species that we need to learn more about. It's a species that we need to investigate, that we need to do research on, and we need to find out if the populations are declining. Maybe they're not. And you will see that some of the species have been removed from the threatened and endangered species list, in the in need of management list, because we have learned more about them. We've learned that they're more common than we thought. So in need of management means that we study them. We conduct research, especially on our wildlife management areas, to see if these species are declining or not. An example of that would be the alligator the alligator gar. You know, the alligator gar, again, is a species that we are stocking, well, we're not stocking, but we're increasing the populations by restoring and releasing animals. We've released thousands of alligator gar throughout the state, and when I talk to folks in West Tennessee, fishermen are catching them. Boaters are seeing them. So their numbers are increasing. So it is our hopes by the next time we come up or years down the road that we will remove this species from the list entirely. That's always the goal, is to remove species from this list. So why do we have this list, other than the fact that we have to do it? There are common sense reasons we have this list. One is that it allows us to be proactive in the conservation of species that are declining. So when we are proactive, we can actively go out and conserve populations of these species and ensure that they do not get further in decline. So again, it guides our efforts and it allows us to be proactive. It also keeps the management of rare species in the hands of Tennessee. So if we can prevent a species from becoming federally listed, federally endangered, then that allows us to maintain the management over that species. If it does decline to the point that it becomes federally listed, then we have to follow federal laws. We have to follow federal regulations. And so that makes things like development even more, contingent upon rules that aren't of this state. It also keeps us compliant with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So we have an agreement with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that we will update this list. And when we don't, we're not compliant with them, and they could do things like affect some funding. So some of our success stories. So because of this list, again, because we focused our attention on certain species that were in decline, especially in the past, we have things like the osprey that in 1975 was state endangered. Now, some of this was due to DDT, but we still use the same methods. We still, hacked species. Remember Bob Hatcher? Bob Hatcher was, he was hacking eagles. He was hacking osprey. He was, involved in the peregrine falcon nesting successes. And because of that, again, these species have inclined. And in 1975, a species that was state endangered is now being delisted completely. And that is just because of the success of projects such as, the hacking projects. So the one thing to keep in mind about this list is it is ever changing. It is not a static list. It is a dynamic list, and it's based on science. And whenever we get our experts together, we determine whether or not these species are inclining or increasing or decreasing. And this list does change. The bald eagle, 1973, was federally endangered, again, because of hacking and other projects, completely delisted in 2007. So now the bald eagle is not endangered, threatened. Peregrine falcon, completely extirpated in the state between the 1940s and the 1990s. And in this particular T&E rule, we are asking that the peregrine falcon be completely removed from the list, and that falconers can use peregrine falcons in the ancient art of falconry. And so, that would be one of the benefits of this list. We should have falconers here today, because they would be excited about this.
Andy,
Yeah.
would you be so kind? I'm sure everybody in the room knows what hacking is.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's except for Chairman Cook and myself. It sounds like something that would not be a productive thing to do. So would you explain to me and perhaps
sorry.
Chairman Cook what that means so we can understand it and celebrate this success with you?
There you go. So hacking is when you take a baby, eagle or hawk, and you take it and you put it into what they call hacking towers. And so, they did that a lot at Cordell Hall. They did it in areas across the state. But then these very young birds were raised in a way that they would not be imprinted on humans. And so imprinted means that if you were just to feed, if I was just to feed you and I was your mother, then you would think that you were human. But with hacking, you do it in a way that the bird never associates humans as their caregiver, and then they're released into the wild. So Bob Hatcher was really into hacking. So some of these changes to our threatened and endangered and in need of management list. So we have added 24 state species. Of those, 13 were already federally listed. So if, as Bobby told you, if a species is on the federal list, it automatically has to be on our state list. So 13 of those 24 were already federally listed. 5 species were removed completely from the threatened and endangered list. So that's a pretty major accomplishment, to remove 5 species from your threatened and endangered list. Didn't go down to in need of management. We determined that we could take it right off at the federal at the threatened and endangered level. 2 species were downgraded to in need of management. Golden eagles and Buick's wren were downlisted. And then 4 in need of management. We added 20 new species for in need of management, and what that means is we're going to study them. So we're going to focus some attention of research on these species. But we removed 20, so we're kind of even keel as far as in need of management. So the number of species in this proposed rule. So we have 45 mussels that would be state endangered. All 45, with the parentheses here, means that they're federally endangered. So all 45 of these are on the federal endangered species list. We have 3 threatened mussels. All 3 of those are on the federal list. Snails, we have 3 endangered snails. All 3 of those are on the federal list. We have 14 crayfish. Only one of those is on the federal endangered species list. But a lot of our crayfish are endemic to Tennessee. And so they're not going to be federally listed because they only occur here. And so we have to protect what we have as endemics in the state. 6 are threatened. We have 26 fish. 17 of those are federally endangered. And you can see these numbers. 17 fish are threatened with 5 endangered. We have 2 endangered amphibians, 4 threatened amphibians, 4 threatened reptiles, 3 in need of management reptiles, 3 bats that are federally listed. Bats, we're having to deal with white nose syndrome. And so that's the reason bats have been increasing on the list. 3 are threatened, with 1 on the federally threatened, and 2 in need of management. And other mammals is the northern flying squirrel. That, as you recall, when I did present the Section 6 budget expansion, the northern flying squirrel is something that's getting a lot of attention and funding. So, species listing determination. So how do we go about this? So if something's on a the federal endangered species list, we automatically put it on the state list. From there, we go to best available science. So we take what we know as far as these species go. So research, expert opinion. So you notice that the staff wanted to address this in 2015. The reason that we wanted to address this in 2015 was because we had just written our state wildlife action plan. And at that point in time, we know more about all of our non-game species than we're ever going to know at any time is after we've just completed the state wildlife action plan. Because we have gathered all of our experts together, we've been studying these and compiling the research. So that is why the timing is around 2015. So our experts come from universities, they come from organizations, nonprofits such as the Tennessee Ornithological Society, they come from TDEC, a lot of folks here in the room, they come from the Nashville Zoo. So there's many different types of experts that we bring together. And if you look at this picture, a lot of the experts on these species are us. You know, a lot of them are TWRA wildlife biologists. A lot of the folks that are in this picture are in the room today. And so we sometimes are the expert ourselves. We're the ones doing a lot of the research. So with that in mind, are there any questions?
Any questions from the commission? None?
What?
Because I'm one of the ones that, no, actually, I never heard of that. I thought maybe he was killing them. Glad you asked the question. Thank you for the presentation. The quality of the biologist and that kind of thing does not bother me. The problem I have with listing anything is the effect that it has on development and the economy. And I know that's a fine line to walk, but, you know, you said that your goal is to delist. Well, it probably is, but it also is to list, isn't it?
It's not our goal, that's not our objective. We would hope, if we do list, that it focuses our attention and it gives us leverage to be able to focus attention on that particular species.
When Bill was here last time, he made the statement that we might have something that's endangered in Tennessee, but not in Alabama. So we're gonna recommend to the feds that it be listed. But if it's not endangered and it's like, we don't have polar bears in Tennessee, so they're endangered in Tennessee, but they're not an endangered species. So, that's maybe not a good analogy, but it's kind of, that's what bothers me. It's the process and how do you decide, and because it's not done, it has a broad effect when you list something in a stream or something that affects landowners and the economy and that kind of thing. And it's just, you have to be I think you have to be very careful that you don't do that in a vacuum, and that if you don't find this crayfish, I call them crawfish, right here in Nashville, does that mean that you've looked in other streams all over the state and in Kentucky and Alabama, and they're just not anywhere except right here in Nashville?
I think David Withers has looked in every stream.
So, that's it just gives me pause it just scares me a little bit that we
Right.
recommend to the feds that this and that needs to be listed when perhaps it's very plentiful in another state.
Well, many of these species that we list are endemics, which means that they only occur in Tennessee. So that's the reason we have a number of species on our list that are not on the federal list, because they occur no place else other than Tennessee. They're endemics to our state. And a lot of those are crayfish that have very limited range. A lot of times will occur in headwaters. And so they do not occur anyplace else. And so we are the only ones that can protect them, is because they only occur here. And part of the rule is that you do have to look at how it might affect business. And I'll point out Brian Flock, because he wrote the information packet that you have. In that, it is estimated that perhaps 50 businesses will be affected by this. Whenever a species such as endangered species or threatened species are found in an area that work is going to be done, it's estimated that no more than $5,000 is required to be able to conduct the sweeps or any efforts that have to be riparian zone buffers or whatever needs to be done for those particular species. Typically, it's not a huge burden on businesses. And Rob Todd is here as well, and he's the one that deals with permits. In our estimation, it's never stopped development in Tennessee.
So one more question.
Okay.
The last update to this list was 17 years ago. Why did it take so long to do this when we're supposed to do it every 2 years, and why are we doing it now?
We are doing it now. We should have been doing it throughout this, every other year for the last 17 years. There's been turnover in the Biodiversity Division, so we've had two different coordinators. So that could have been part of the issue. But also, starting in 2005, so we started, and actually even earlier, like 2003, we started focusing a great deal of attention on the state wildlife action plans. So even though we haven't updated this rule or this proclamation as it is now, we've been looking at these species. We've been determining what is a species of greatest conservation need, and a lot of effort has been put into the SWAP plans. So because we are working so hard on the SWAP and mapping and gathering information and gathering those experts together, when you saw that picture, it had SWAP in front of it, and that's because it was part of the SWAP planning process. And so we've been working on these species, we just haven't put it into the actual rule.
But it's been 17 years since we've updated, and you're saying the feds are requiring us, anything on their endangered list, we have to have it on ours?
Correct.
And they've not caught that in the past, so, I mean, they've just now caught it and making us do that?
There are folks that are paying attention to this fact.
Okay, all right, I understand. But the ones that's not on their list, we don't have to put it on Tennessee's list, right?
That is not a federal requirement, that if it's not on their list, we do not have to put it as a federal requirement. But as state biologists, we choose to do that to protect the populations.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Chairman Woodson?
First, thank you for your presentation, and if Ed's got something he wants to share now, I've got a question kind of on the point of kind of state versus federal regulation.
Okay.
But Ed, I don't want to, do you need to?
Tag on to a couple things whenever.
He's trying
I
to,
think, he's definitely not, Pandy. Well, this is just, it's so directly on point, and you can certainly add to this, and y'all can tag team on the answer. So this is kind of a little bit to the crux of this question. One, it's the supremacy clause that actually governs if the feds actually put something in terms of federal protection, that applies to us, whether we recognize that or not. It's actually federal law and regulatory policy. So under the Constitution of our United States, the supremacy clause rules. So whether we acknowledge that or not, that is reality. Is that fair to say?
I would have to defer to our legal team.
Cheryl's nodding at me. Okay, so that's one. So that is so. On the state versus federal regulation, I think it's a really important point for, I'd say, to a person on the commission, folks who are trying to understand species management and the balancing impact of economic issues and all of those different things. You talked about your goal, and I think it's a critically important one, is to get species off the list. And it would seem to me, and so check me here, that under a state framework, by paying attention at the early signs of pressure on a species, for us to proactively deal with that would ultimately keep the federal regulatory structure from coming to Tennessee and being more costly, time-consuming, and take those issues out of the state's hands to the federal framework. And so it seems to me that this is an effort to, in the long term, shorten cost, time, and other issues. Is that a fair assessment? Or is
Absolutely.
that, I want to make sure I'm getting that clear, and I think for all of us who are trying to be really thoughtful about the impact this has on folks who are trying to thoughtfully, develop and spur economic development and whatever that might look like. I think that's a really important part of this. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it gives us the opportunity to be proactive. And so, again, let's just take the Nashville crayfish for an example. Someone wants to do some development along the buffer of Mill Creek, and we've got the Nashville crayfish there. And we go in and we take the crayfish, we move them upstream, they do their development. But what we've done is we protected that population. So that's one more population that exists because of the efforts that we committed to working around the species. So because we've got one more population there, that means it's one less reason to add it to the federal endangered species. Although Nashville crayfish is already on the federal endangered species list, it is currently being considered for downlisting. And it's because of these certain protocols that we have for protecting the species. So yeah, the Nashville crayfish is endangered right now, but because of what we do as far as limiting the effects on the different populations, it is currently being seriously considered for downlisting. Right. So, but yes, what you say is true, and you said it much better than I did.
I know, I definitely did. And the second thing, and this is again, I think back to Commissioner Wood's thoughtful question, is like the number of years that have gone by where we haven't assess this. It's our state law that requires this of us.
Correct.
So as I'm understanding this, we have been, by the entity, which is the Tennessee General Assembly that creates this organization, both the agency as well as the commission, by state statute, we have a requirement to do this every 2 years, and we have not done that.
Correct.
So I think that is something for us to think about.
Right.
Okay.
Director Carter?
Just to throw in a couple other comments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me start to Commissioner Cox's comment a second ago. If we implied during our presentation last time that we suggest to the federal government which species to list, that would not be correct. So we shouldn't have said that. What we do go in and look at those species, and we say by the criteria from several different ways to try to decide whether or not something needs management, it needs to be looked at as endangered, or it needs to be looked at as threatened. So that's the criteria we go in. Let me back up just for a second. You're exactly right in everything you just brought forward in terms of the federal and the state listings. Just to mention a couple of things, several years ago, there was a movement called the Conservation and Reinvestment Act, which was called TWRA, and it was a way to try to find funding for animals that are neither hunted or fished for, where there was no stream of income. Well, in the state law, it says that this General Assembly should make investments into this and that they should fund endangered species. Well, to my knowledge, it's happened one time. So we've never had the state funding to go forward on this, other than what's come out of the normal income that the agency has from selling licenses and those kind of things. So going back to CARA, to the Conservation Reinvestment Act, there was a big national effort to push forward a way to fund that, and it was through a series of additional excise taxes on things like binoculars and anything that have been used for essentially non-wildlife type things. But it got very close to passing in the way that it was brought forward, but it failed to go that full distance, and it came forward with an amount of money, but the only way that a state could be eligible for that money was to put together a state wildlife action plan that looked at all of those animals that we're talking about here, regardless whether they're aquatic, terrestrial, or whatever. We'd put those together in this state wildlife action plan and say what we needed to do to address those animals going forward in terms of their management. So at the end of 10 years, we were supposed to redo that plan, and we have. We just redid, as Pandy said, about 2 years ago. So that, I won't say we're derelict in not bringing forth this list as we were required to every 2 years. I think one of the things that it got caught up in was this whole movement on a national level to everybody stop, go back, look at what this is, come forward with a specific plan, which we've done now. We're into our second plan. Actually, we were recognized nationally for our plan that was put together the first time, and we followed up, I think, with all of our partners to put together a very good plan going forward. So anyway, this is where we are now. And you've talked about me. I mean, I've talked with you all. You have talked about me. I remember that. Yeah. I've talked with you all about this blue ribbon panel, and I've brought that forward several times. The legislation on a federal basis has finally been introduced, and it's brought forward by a whole consortium of industry and organizational people, most outside of government agencies, to put this together, with the oil companies actually being part of that as well. So they put that together. The legislation's been introduced. It hasn't gone full sponsors in both the House and the Senate. But what it's doing is to do exactly what we're trying to do here. The way the bill was written, they took every state wildlife action plan in the nation and it said, if you were to implement programs to keep these animals off of the listing, what would it take for you to do that? And every state put forward what they thought that would take. It came up to about $1.5 billion. So Congress has put together a funding model to put that kind of funding back into the states for these kind of programs. For Tennessee, if it passed like it is right now, would be between $19 and $22 million a year to work on these kind of animals to make sure that they stay off the listing. And that's forefront in everything that's in that legislation. Just this week, the U.S. Congress in debating budgets, and there's been huge changes in U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The committee, the very first committee that's gone through the funding, the appropriations for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of Interior, looked at all of these different programs together, and I was pretty proud. They came back and they said, the Southeast is the leader in the nation in working together collaboratively with the federal government to try to stop animals from being listed. And they specifically noticed a couple of programs that the southeastern states have put together and pushed forward. And they pointed out that the collaborative issues to make these animals stay on the state list, and as Pandy mentioned, once it goes federal, we lose pretty much any kind of say-so that we have in how that goes forward in management. So if we can keep those off the federal list, then, and that's what this committee did. They said, this is a great thing, and because of that, even though the president zeroed out the funding for all those programs that put this forward, they reinstated this week full funding for every one of those programs. I don't know that it will make it through Congress, but the committee that starts the appropriations has put that forward. So I know that was a long, winding story to get to where we are, but I just wanted you to know that there's a lot of people working on this, and the full intent is to keep animals off the list. And when we put them on, it really does just focus our attention. And part of it is relocation, and I'll finish my dissertation here in just a second, I promise. But one of the things that we try to do when we find, like a Nashville crayfish, or name any other species, but I'll go to mussels, for instance. When we find an endangered mussels, and just recently, our personnel found an endangered mussel that was actually thought to be extinct, but they found it, they put the thing in our aquatic center up on the Cumberland River Aquatic Center, which is the only hatchery we have where we're raising things for endangered species. They now have, I think the number's up to 10,000 that they've raised, that they're going to be releasing throughout, with the idea being that if these things can be relocated in other streams and other river systems across the state, then they're no longer in need of being listed either state or federal. So that's another one of the goals, is to relocate where we can if we can propagate those species. So don't talk about me anymore. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Director Carter.
Just right on the end of what you said, you said you've got 10,000 now, and we can maybe relocate and get those off the federal list. What if Tennessee feels, yeah, we've got enough of them, and the Fed says, no, we don't, so we could hinder development. We're talking about what you think is enough, and they don't think it's enough.
That's a huge issue right now.
Yeah.
I'll just drop back again, different species, but grizzly bears, wolves, and prairie chickens have been in the news kind of throughout the nation, but specifically in the western states. And then a very recent development in Alaska, where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service changed some rules so that the state can no longer manage part of its endemic populations as related to subsistence for some of the native people there. So that brought to head a lot of things about who has jurisdiction and what makes a species a state jurisdiction versus a federal jurisdiction. So with all that being said, that rule has been reversed, and it no longer is there in the Alaska side. Those animals that we talked about, the big iconic species out west, that's going to part of what I was just talking about, that Congress and this committee was talking about. They want to see the states take the lead on what management is done in a state, and the only time the federal government should get involved is when it's a nationally listed species. So I hope to, if I can answer your question by saying, if we list it and they don't, it really has no impact on anything other than saying, hey, we're looking at this animal, it may be only endemic in Tennessee, but we're looking at it, and then the feds don't get involved until they make a determination of their own that it needs to be on their list. So if we take it off of ours and it stays on theirs, then it has to stay on ours. But if they list it, I mean, if we list it, they don't necessarily have to list it. And if we can push it out to other locations, then it probably won't be listed at all. Thank you.
Mr. Cox.
Chairman, is the state listing affect a TDEC 404 permit or some kind of, I mean, does it go through to the TDEC environmental permitting process?
We keep a database jointly between our organizations, and when somebody applies for a permit or anything, one of the things that we do is see what group of animals are there. I would defer, if it's okay, to the folks from TDEC to address that as to how it involves their permitting.
That's all right. It does, but I mean, there's a database that they refer to, basically.
Yes.
We don't need to. And the second question I have for you, and I got one for young lady, what does this cost in licensed dollars? Is this all federal, or are we matching it, and how much does it match?
It's a combination of both, and the match is different on endangered or threatened species. We get a lot of grants that require either no match or for instance, U.S. Corps of Engineers, because of their management of river systems on Cumberland River, for instance, or all the ones on the Tennessee where the TVA is involved, both give grants to our agency to go forward, and there is no match. I think the last one we got from the U.S. Corps of Engineers was around $700,000 to go forward with helping on the mussel side. But anyway, it's a combination of both, Commissioner. I could get you exact figures on what it costs, but there's also specialty money. You'll hear us talk about Section 6, that's a section out of the Endangered Species Act that gives grants to states to address these kind of things.
Last question, I promise. Is there an effort to find out why you used alligator gar as an example? Is there an effort to find out why these animals are struggling?
Yes. So when we create the State Wildlife Action Plan, a part of that plan is threats. So a whole chapter is the threats to the species that are listed. And so, yes, we look at water quality, we look at, harvesting, we look at predation. So that is a part of the State Wildlife Action Plan, is to determine why these species are species of greatest conservation need, and we list those threats with each species.
Some of it is a change in habitat, and I'll use the alligator gar. There used to be alligator gar in the Wolf River, Fayette and Shelby County. And the river system has changed there from siltation and whatever, but the habitat changed and the gar couldn't survive.
Correct.
And Bobby Wilson, we had this conversation, we wanted to stock alligator gar in the Wolf River. Well, the river's changed to the point that if you put gar back there, they'll eat up everything in the river because of the way the river rises and falls in pockets and that kind of thing. So I just wondered how you determine where you put them and what caused them to go away, because it could be habitat that you can't fix.
That's true, but we are always into restoring habitat wherever possible, if that's within the realm of possibility. And I'm not an alligator gar, expert, but yes, so sometimes the habitat is gone, but sometimes we can restore habitat. And whenever I'm in meetings, biodiversity meetings, wildlife diversity meetings, and sometimes West Tennessee will be chopped off of the priority list because of channelization or things of that sort, and we just don't think now that we have to eliminate West Tennessee from restoration efforts. Some of the places, could have alligator gar back in it. Alligator snapping turtle in West Tennessee can be a part of the conservation planning. So, thank you.
Thank you, Pandy.
Thank you.
I'd like to recognize Mike Butler from the Tennessee Wildlife Federation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike Butler, Tennessee Wildlife Federation. I had to step out to take a call on this topic for the last hour. Just a couple of short things that you may find useful. The two organizations at the national level that have been tapped to lead the national campaign for this legislation, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act legislation, are the National Wildlife Federation and the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation.